Assessing intelligence. So, now that we know what it is, how do we assess it? Well, there's different types of tests. So we have intelligence tests, and these look at different mental aptitudes and compare them using numerical scores. And we'll talk about those. Aptitude tests. This is how we use tests to predict somebody's future ability or future capacity to learn. So SAT tests, ACT tests, those are aptitude tests. Those are supposed to predict how well you do in college. And then achievement tests. We've taken we take those all the time. It's to determine what you've learned. So every quiz in class, every exam, those are achievement tests. Now, how does aptitude and intelligence scores relate? Well, this is a curve for SATs here. And yes, generally the people that have higher IQs may score higher, but not really. Here's someone with a 120 IQ that scored pretty low. There's other factors when it comes to testing. Anybody out there have test anxiety? Raise your hand, right? So that is going to affect how well you do in exams. So testing is not the only way, or aptitude and intelligence don't always correlate. So over in our past, it was important for some to assess intelligence and to figure out where people were, where their mental abilities were. Alfred Binet was tasked with understanding or testing children to help determine who was educatable and who wasn't. Right now, in our country, everyone gets an education regardless of IQ. 100 years ago, 200 years ago, wasn't the case. It was those that were teachable and those that had the capacity to learn were put in school, and those that weren't. So Alfred Binet came up with a way to test to see if children were, how well they would do in school and if they should go to school. Terman came up with a test that was to be used wider in the United States. It extended the upper test range. For Alfred Binet's reasons, he just needed to make sure that kids hit a certain level, and anything above that, they were going to succeed in school. So Terman wanted to look at these broad levels of intelligence and where people would fall on a broader scale. So he came up with this idea that IQ is mental age over chronological age times 100. So you can imagine if you had an 8-year-old with the mental age of a 10-year-old, they would have an IQ of 125. Here's another way of imagining that. So you have a 10-year-old whose mental age is 15. You ever talked to a really intelligent 10-year-old who is very mature and who seems like you're talking to an adult? Okay, you can imagine that that individual has a higher IQ than average. And if that's the case, a 10-year-old with a mental age of 15, their IQ would be 150. Reverse that. You have a 15-year-old who has the mental age of a 10-year-old. They would be behind what we would assume would be normal for them, and it would become apparent that their IQ was not as high as average. So when it comes to kind of visualizing what it would look like for these different IQ levels, you can use this formula to determine based on like a typical 10-year-old with mental age of 10, chronological age of 10 would be 100, and that is average. So use that when visualizing and understanding how we attribute numbers to IQ. Wechsler came up with different tests for testing adults and children. The Wechsler test for kids is often used to determine IQ. It gives you a score. It also helps you by giving you areas that their strengths and weaknesses. So like verbal comprehension, perceptual organization, working memory, processing speed. Kids can take it at preschool, school age versions. It does give you strengths and weaknesses. I was talking to a psychologist who this is what he does. He tests kids all day and has for 17 years. So he is an expert and someone that I turned to. And I asked him, I had heard rumors that you want to test him early. And he said, no, testing him between 12 and 16 is good. That's when your IQ kind of stabilizes out. And there is no reason to test a child unless there's an issue. So if the kid's doing well in school and there's no problems and they're getting the education that they need and they're thriving, why test them? Just to get a number so you can slap that number on them? No, that's not the purpose. If you've got a kid who's struggling and they are having issues in school, they're bored, the administration or the school isn't adjusting to the kid's needs, that's when you go get them tested. But it's only when the kid will benefit from being tested. And we don't benefit from numbers, but we do benefit from the other information, the strengths, the weaknesses, the abilities. If you've got a child in 4th grade and they're mentally running at a 8th grade level, they're going to have a hard time in 4th grade unless they can be accommodated. And if they can't, then getting them tested and proving, showing, demonstrating that these kids need accommodations, that's why you get them tested. But you don't just go test a kid for no reason. Plus they're expensive. Tests like this can run anywhere from $500 to a couple $1,000, and most insurances won't cover it. So there's that. There are good criteria for tests. So was the test standardized? Is it reliable? Is it valid? So what do those mean? Okay. Standardization is when the testing procedure and the scores from a big comparison group are used to assess the performance of a pre-test group. So there's a group of individuals that are tested and they're compared to a pre-test. So it's kind of like if I took all of my 101 tests and I used another group to test to make sure that the test is standardized and giving it to another group and comparing scores. Reliability is the test really consistent in results? So if I give you an IQ test today and then I give it to you next week, are the scores going to be relatively consistent, or are they going to be wildly different? If they're wildly different, then the reliability of the test isn't that great. But if they're generally consistent, then there's some good reliability. Now, validity is the test measuring really what it's supposed to measure? Is it predicting what it's supposed to predict? There's external validity and there's internal validity. And for discussion here, just overall validity, if I give you a psychology test and it's on a bunch of math questions, is that really going to predict your understanding or measure your understanding of psychology? So it's not really a valid test. Content validity is the test samples the behavior of interest. Predictive validity is the success at which a test predicts behavior. So if I give you a test that has predictive validity, meaning that it's a psychology test and it's going to tell me how well you'll do in the next psychology class, then it should give me some reasonable expectation of your abilities in the next psychology class. So that's what predictive validity means. Why is that important? Why test? If we're going to test somebody's intelligence, or if we're going to give somebody an SAT test to predict their success in college, we want to be able to see how well students are going to do. If it doesn't have predictive validity, then it's very difficult to do anything with it. So predictive validity is pretty important when it comes to the type of test that's being used and what it's being used for. Now here's a normal curve for IQ. So meaning that underneath here, these are all these data points of people that were tested for their IQ. Okay, so obviously there's people testing at 100 there's more people that test at 100. Between 85 and 115, we're looking at 68% of the population. Between 70 and 130, we're looking at 95% of the population. So this is a distribution curve. Below 70, below 70 becomes, below 55 becomes profoundly intellectually disabled. So there's a deficit here. So these are people that probably won't be able to take care of themselves or live on their own. And it's 0.1% of the population. Above 145 is considered genius level, and that again also is 0.1% of the population. So it's 1/10 of 1%. So here we don't see very many people. Down here we don't see very many people. The majority of people fall under this main. So here is 1 standard deviation. Here's 2 standard deviations. Here's 3 standard deviations. Here's 4. So the more standard deviations you get away from the middle or the mean, the rarer it becomes. And that's the end for this module. Stay tuned for the next one.